All right, I hit record, so beware. So we'll get started. So I'm Bill Kramer. I run Wonderful Machine, and I'm here today with Craig Oppenheimer, who is our executive producer, and Brian Sheffield, who is our project manager on branding and marketing projects. And some other Wonderful Machine staff members may come and go, like Nadia is there, who can wave as well. Nadia's one of our producers, or associate producers, depending on how you look at it. So today we're going to talk about contracts, and in particular, the terms and conditions part of a contract. And my own experience, the language that we use, that Craig uses on a lot of the contracts we put together for clients, and when we help photographers craft contracts, a lot of this language has just come out of my own experience over the years. I was a commercial and editorial photographer for about 25 years. And so I learned the hard way how to put together a contract. When I was, I guess, 23 years old, and I first joined ASMP, at my first meeting, they handed me a whole bunch of materials, including a page of terms and conditions, and I didn't know what that was, but I read through it, and it was very dense language that sounded very bulletproof, and in terms of legality, but also bulletproof in terms of my own understanding. It was very difficult for me to make sense of. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, I can't really send a client a contract that I don't myself understand. So my tactic was instead to start with a very basic contract, and over time, every time something bad happened, I just added another paragraph to my contract. And so I remember having a situation where a client asked me to bid on a project that was a black and white photo shoot, a local ad campaign in Philadelphia, and they in the middle of the shoot, the head of the agency said, "Hey, this would be really great to get in color. Do you have any color film with you?" And I said, "Sure, I've got color film." And so I shot in color. And then when I sent them the invoice for the job, I included an invoice for the color film as well as the black and white film. And the agency president was like, "Well, you didn't bid on on color. You just bid on black and white." I said, "Well, you asked me. You yourself asked me to shoot color film on the shoot." And he said, "It doesn't matter. You don't have this in your estimate." And so I've had a number of ugly situations over my career that I've learned to protect myself from as best as I can. Although even a contract is not going to protect you from people doing bad things to you, but it's something. So I'd like to introduce Craig Oppenheimer, who will walk through our current terms and conditions, and together we'll talk about what that means in plain language, and answer any questions you guys might have. And also we'd love to have your suggestions as well, because I'm sure that our terms and conditions are not bulletproof, and could probably use some improvement, just like anything else. So Craig, please take it away.
Thank you. What's up, everybody? It's good to put some faces to names, and just so you guys, as you can tell, I'm here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have some beautiful tapestries and some statues and a mobile. There's free yoga on Wednesday nights. It's a good place to be. So I hope you're all enjoying your quarantine life wherever you are. Obviously recognize a lot of names I've worked with, I think everyone on this call in some capacity. But to kick things off, generally as a producer, a big part of my job naturally revolves around paperwork. Whether it's estimates or invoices, model property releases, permits, location agreements, purchase orders, production books. Every production ends up with a giant pile of paperwork or a digital folder of paperwork. And inherently, it's just part of my job to know and understand that stuff. It's probably not something you guys want to have to manage or really understand. I know you guys want to focus on the creative, but as a producer, it's my job to understand this stuff. And I think it's important that you guys understand what you're asking clients to sign as well. One critical part of that paperwork puzzle is the initial estimate or bid that you put together, which should come along with terms and conditions. I think it's important to also know that your terms are just as important as your fees and expenses. Generally, the terms and conditions along with your fees and expenses are what allows us to use the estimate we put together as a formal agreement for a project to happen, for a client to sign off on something. If the fees and expenses represent the money, the terms and conditions basically set the rules for the project, whether that's payment terms or cancellation agreements, copyright information, definitions of terminology, post-production, how that's going to play out. It really covers everything that will ultimately protect yourself during the production, rather than just assuming that you and a client are on the same page about everything. Most of the time, if something weird pops up during a production, you want to have your butt covered, and that's where these terms and conditions come into play. Like Bill said, a lot of our terms and conditions have come from Bill's experience as a commercial and editorial photographer, and we've evolved them over the years and revised them and added language. It's interesting how our terms and conditions have seemingly become standard with a lot of photographers, I think, as a result of the pricing and negotiating articles that we write. A lot of times I'll see estimates from photographers that I've never even worked with before, and they're using our terms and conditions, which I think goes to show you that I think it strikes the right balance between plain English and what could be seen as sort of just fine print legal jargon. And I also wanted to take the opportunity just to let you know, I'm not a legal professional. None of these terms and conditions contain much legal language. It's just plain English that help cover your butt during productions. I also think it's important to know that best case scenario, a client's going to sign your estimate with your terms and conditions, which might be very similar to our terms and conditions. But sometimes clients aren't going to sign your estimate, and they're going to give you a purchase order instead. And that purchase order might have 5 to 10 pages of fine print. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, as long as those terms match your terms, or at least are agreeable to you. So it's just important to know that, while these terms and conditions have been honed over the years, and it's important to present them with any numbers that you might be showing a client, in the end, they might not sign this, but they may give you a purchase order instead. Most large ad agencies are going to give you a purchase order as opposed to signing an estimate. But regardless, having a purchase order, having some kind of formal agreement that is signed, is going to really protect you. I work with a lot of photographers that come to me with a situation, hey, this weird thing happened, can you help me out? And I'll say, oh, well, what did the agreement say? And they'll say, oh, there was no agreement. Like, it was just like a couple of emails. And I think it's important that regardless if it's a purchase order or an estimate or whatever it is, you have some kind of document that is agreed to by both parties to lay out the terms for a project. So with that, I'm going to...
Craig, let me just jump in and remind folks, we would love to have questions and feedback along the way. If you want to jump in with a question, that's fine. If you want to add a question to the chat, that's fine too. And I'll keep an eye on that and help jump in with questions as we go.
Great. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back and forth between sharing my screen and going through our terms and conditions, and also kind of take it line by line. So let me see. Can you guys see this screen right here? Okay.
Yep.
So this is a redacted estimate it was a rather straightforward project, but before we get to the terms, just generally, this is what our estimate typically looks like. It has the general information at the top, a project description, which covers the who, what, where, and when. That's this section up here. Any provisions that a client might be giving you during a production, your fees and expenses. And
Craig, don't gloss over that. I think that's really important. The idea that when you're doing a shoot, you might expect that the client is going to provide certain things, like a location, or like some of the props, or some of the wardrobe, or whatever. So it's really important to specify not only what you're going to provide and what that's going to cost, but also what the client is going to provide, or your talent is going to provide, or other people are going to provide, because you don't want to get to the shoot and then that thing's not there and the client's looking at you. So it's important to have your estimate cover everything, even everything that the shoot needs to take place, whether you're going to provide it or not.
Right. So if we're going to say what a client is going to be providing, this is typically where we do that. And after that typically comes, fees and expenses with the bottom line. And that's when we get into the terms and conditions, which start here. So, some of these sections I'm going to read word for word. Some are pretty lengthy. And I'm kind of going to jump back and forth between sharing my screen here and talking to you guys. But so first is this agreement section, which basically says, I'll kind of go line by line. I think it's important. We've crammed a lot into this first agreement section. It says this agreement between the above referenced photographer, herein creator, and the undersigned client, herein client, or agency representative, herein agency, governs the project described terms and constitutes the entire agreement between the parties. The fees and expenses are based on the job description as presented by the client or agency and summarized above. That's a lot for just a little bit of information right there. But basically, let me see if I can stop sharing my screen here. There I am. Basically, what that says is, this is our agreement. I'm the creator. You're the client. If there's an agency involved, we're going to call them agency in this agreement. I've described the project as thoroughly as I can in the job description that's above in this estimate, just to make sure that we're on the same page about who, what, where, when, and why. And I've detailed the fees and expenses that I think are necessary to get the job done. That's basically what that says. From there, it says the client or agency is responsible for the presence of an authorized representative at the shoot to approve the creator's interpretation of the project. If a client or agency representative is not present, the creator's interpretation shall be deemed acceptable. Basically, that means that you, client, need to be at the shoot to approve what I am capturing. Generally speaking, productions are a large collaboration of ideas, and creative briefs are sometimes open to interpretation. And if the client isn't there to make sure that they are on the same page with you, you want to contractually make sure that they are going to trust you to execute the project. We have had instances in which I've consulted with photographers and productions that we've done where a client wasn't there, and they showed up at the beginning of the shoot, they disappeared during the production, and they weren't happy with the results for various reasons. One was a client wasn't happy with the hair makeup styling for some corporate headshots that a photographer was doing. In that case, the client left the project. Basically, they showed up at 8 o'clock, helped set up, and then left for the day. If they were there to see what was happening, or we had some sort of remote approval process, which we weren't prepared to do because we thought they were going to be there with us, that wouldn't have been a problem. But because they left and weren't there to approve it, and then were upset after the fact, it caused an issue. So you just want to protect yourself in these situations. There's lots of similar stories with clients that just aren't happy for various reasons. There's sometimes clients are going to be upset even if they are there on the shoot and are approving every step of the process. But just generally, you want to protect yourself that if no one's there, that they're going to trust you to do what you believe is the assignment. So from there, let me go back to share my screen here.
One other thought, Craig, that reminds me of is the idea that when you're putting together an estimate, it's not unusual when you're having conversations with the client is going to tell you more or less what they know about what they want. But inevitably there are going to be things there, you're going to need to make certain assumptions. And so don't be surprised when you're putting together an estimate that you don't have the answers to every possible question that you might want, because you only have limited time of phone calls and email exchanges before you actually have to put together your estimate. But what's very important is that you imagine all the things that need to take place, and you have to sort of commit to certain assumptions and spell them out. And so as long as you articulate clearly what your vision for the shoot is, how you're going to execute it, what it's going to cost, you're giving the client an opportunity to come back and say, oh, no, I didn't have that in mind. I had this in mind. But it's just very important to be as comprehensive as possible on a shoot, so that the client has the opportunity to say, no, I want to do it a different way. But if you leave things unsaid, you just open yourself up for a lot of confusion once the shoot comes along.
Right, and to Bill's point, whenever I'm drafting an estimate, at the beginning, I'm lucky if we have 50% of the information we actually need. And then, after a detailed call or lengthy call with the client, even after asking all the questions, we're still lucky if we have 80% of the information that I wish we had. And we have to make some assumptions with most projects. And it's important to have a discussion throughout all steps of the process, from bidding through production, to make sure you're on the same page. And that actually leads to a good point about changes during a production. And we have the next line here, which says that any changes, whether made orally or in writing, may result in additional charges. The expenses are estimated in good faith, and a 10% variance applies to the total. Basically, that says that if anything changes from what is detailed up in the job description, it might cost you more. And even if nothing changes, you're granting me a 10% variance on these expenses. Every project has changes. Some don't impact the expenses at all. Some definitely do. And a producer's job, or if you don't have one on a project, it's your job, is to manage all the expectations and let a client know when their changes impact the budget. For big changes like adding a day onto a shoot, that's probably one of the bigger ones, something like that. I'll work up an estimate for fees and expenses and get a client to formally sign off on an overage. For little changes, I'm okay with those being approved via email as long as it's very clearly worded. But everyone has a different expectation, and we've seen over the years, some in regards to like the 10% variance. Let me turn my screen off here. In regards to the 10% variance about bids versus estimates, and having to provide receipts or not providing receipts, and is there wiggle room on the bottom line or not? I think lots of clients come from different backgrounds and are used to different things. I think you should always be prepared to provide receipts if a client asks you to, and to justify actual out-of-pocket expenses. But sometimes you might be working on a firm bid, which means that your bottom line is going to stay the same as long as the project scope stays the same. And if you come in under budget, you're going to keep that money in your pocket. But if you go over budget, you're going to pay for that out of pocket. As opposed to an estimate, which basically says you're going to bill for actual fees and expenses, and you're going to justify them with receipts. Ideally, even in those situations, you're not going to drastically go over the budget. But I think it's important to try to figure out ahead of time which of those things you're doing, because it'll help you mentally work through a project, especially when there are changes. So if this were a bid, we might change this and not add the 10% variance in the terms and conditions. And we may have different terminology here, but I think it's, that's definitely a big thing that has come up over the years with working with different photographers and different clients on what their expectations are in terms of billing. But I think it's also important here to, if you have this language in here, it gives you some flexibility to know that you have a little bit of a variance with your fees and expenses. And you should also know that most ad agencies, when they sell their clients on these productions, they're working in somewhere around a 10 to 20% excess in their budget just to cover things that might pop up. So I think it's just important to know that, and that's why we have that language in this estimate here.
So if I could just underscore that difference between an estimate and a bid, there were times when I would send somebody an estimate and they would say, okay, this looks good, just don't go over. And so the implication was that if I came under budget, it would cost them less, but if I came in over budget, I would eat the cost. So it's just really important to be clear with your client whether this is a firm price, regardless of how the actual expenses work out, or whether it truly is an estimate and they're going to get an invoice that reflects the actual costs. So again, it just comes down to communicating that clearly with your client. And Craig, can I just piggyback onto that? Like, are there times when you're going to detail the expense line items and still make it a bid, or when it's a bid, will you just say, here are all the things I'm going to provide, and here's the final price?
You mean like a flat project fee as opposed to detailed fees and expenses? I always detail all of the fees and all of the expenses. If it comes to, when we're negotiating, if we're at a certain price and it's just about figuring out how to get to a certain number and we need to make it a flat project fee, then sometimes I'll revert to just one flat number and just say that everything's included. But I think clients like to see all of the line items, and it helps you as the photographer work through all the things that you need to think about, and it gives clients a sense of what goes into a project. So it's rare that I just have a flat fee and just say that everything's included without showing what those individual line items cost. So just a couple more things in this first agreement paragraph, and then I'll pause. I think it might be a good opportunity to answer some questions. But we mentioned sales tax here. So we say sales tax is not included in the estimate, and any applicable sales tax will be added at the time of invoice. Generally, what that means is, I'm going to charge you sales tax later if I need to. I think every photographer is going to need to check with their accountant to know when and how to charge sales tax. Sometimes it has to do with where you and the client are based, like your companies are based. Sometimes it has to do with whether or not you are delivering a physical product like a hard drive, or if you are later sending digital files. For Wonderful Machine Productions, we typically only charge sales tax to clients who are based in Pennsylvania, because we're based in Pennsylvania. Again, I think you just make sure you have talked to an accountant to know when and how to charge sales tax. But this is also a tactic, as opposed to just including sales tax right from the beginning in your bottom line. By saying that you're going to invoice it later, it gives you an opportunity for your bottom line to be a little bit cheaper than someone else that might be including sales tax. And it's a bit of a tactic to get your bottom line down, but I think you're protecting yourself that, later you're going to charge some sales tax. And when you do, you can look back at this and say, look, I told you I was going to charge you sales tax. I think it's just like, going into any store and buying anything, the fees typically, you assume that sales tax is going to be added on top of that when you go to checkout. Another important thing that we have in this section here, and again, we've crammed a lot into this first agreement section. It says about indemnification. It says the client is going to indemnify and hold creator harmless against any and all liabilities, claims, and expenses, including reasonable attorney's fees arising from clients or agencies' use of the work. What this means basically is that if the client uses the images in any way that gets them in trouble, it's on them and not on you. So hypothetically, let's say you're working on a project for a pharmaceutical client, and your understanding is that the project is about hair restoration drugs. And you and the client and the talent, the models, are all under that understanding. And you do the project, and when they go to use the photos, let's say they instead of a hair treatment, they are promoting like a STD drug or something that puts the model or talent in an uncomfortable spot. And the talent can say, hey, you didn't tell me this was going to be used for this. This is defamation, and I'm going to sue you for doing this. That's an example of when an agency or client would indemnify you. That wouldn't be your fault because you were on a different understanding. There's lots of other, I guess, hypothetical situations where this could be applied, but that's generally what we mean as it revolves around a client's use of the work and then indemnifying you. The last thing we have in this section is that—
Sorry, Craig, can I jump in a second? So it's not unusual in purchase orders from agencies and contracts from magazines. It's not unusual for clients to write contracts that are totally in their favor. Over the years, I've seen the whole gamut of clients who are very fair-minded and write their contracts from both points of view in a way. But I've also seen contracts where it's really just one-sided in the client's favor. So we try to write contracts that factor in their concerns as well. So indemnity is the kind of thing that ideally you want to have a contract that if you, the photographer, do something that gets the client in trouble when it's not their fault, you should really be prepared to indemnify them. And likewise, they should be prepared to indemnify you if they do something that gets you sued through no fault of your own. So indemnification is one of those things where you want it to be symmetrical.
So the last thing we have in this section is just that we said the estimates are valid for 15 days. Really, we put that there because I think it's unreasonable for you to provide an estimate to a client and for them to come back a year from now and expect that the fees and expenses are going to be the same. I mean, the industry changes, expenses change, and you may have been in a mindset where you were willing to do certain things at a certain time, and I think it's just, given certain options for licensing, I think it just makes sense to put a time limit on how long this estimate or contract is good for. So with that covers a lot, but it's all basically in that first agreement section. I thought before we get into the definitions and payment terms and cancellation agreements and all of that, does anyone have any questions just about what we've covered so far? I can't see everyone here, so I'm not sure if anyone's raising their hands or not. Okay, so you all understand everything, and you've never had any issues related to that whatsoever? Okay, cool. All right, well, let's go on to the next section then. So this is a bit of a doozy. Let me share my screen here again. Okay, so I'm not going to read this whole section because you'll all fall asleep before I get finished. But the next section is this definitions section. Let me scroll down here. So basically, we are defining the words that we use, whether it's images or client or agency, but mostly this paragraph has to do with usage terminology. And generally speaking, it says that when I use specific words in this contract, especially regarding usage and licensing, these are the definitions of those words. And I think this is really, really important because you have to be able to articulate specific usage in your estimates, and using the right words to justify different prices is key. You're going to be in situations where clients are going to ask you to price not just 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, but maybe it's advertising, maybe it's collateral, maybe it's packaging, maybe whatever it is, you're going to have to find ways to describe what they're asking for. Because when they ask for options and things change, and you try to negotiate, it's important to be able to make changes to the fees based on changes to the language you're using to describe the usage. And that's outside of sort of the expenses. Some of these words might be just generally understood, like web or packaging, but many we've specifically defined as they mean really specific things. So while we have this like laundry list of definitions that help us handle really specific requests, 95% of the time, I'm really only using 2 words that we've defined here. And those are advertising and collateral. So I will read the definition of advertising. I'm going to go back to me here. Hold on. There I am. So advertising, we define it as advertising use is when the client or agency is paying for the placement of the work on or in whatever media it appears. Collateral use is when the work appears in or on a platform that the client or agency wholly controls and produces, such as a company website, annual report, brochure, social media profile, and is intended to promote a commercial product, service, personality, or brand. Basically, the difference between advertising use and collateral use is that advertising is paid placement and collateral use is not paid placement. And there's generally paid placement is more valuable than not paid placement. So by paid placement, I mean a print ad in a magazine, a a billboard. You know, a client would have to pay a media company to put the image up on the billboard. A web ad, you know, they'd have to pay Google or whoever to put up a web ad. Whenever a client is paying to put an image somewhere, we define that as advertising. It could be web, it could be print. And collateral use, which could also be print or web, is when a client is using images on something that they are not paying to put the images there for. Phrase that wordly. So let's say it's their own website, you know, or a direct mail campaign. You know, they may be paying to print the mailers that go out, but they aren't paying anyone to put those images there. So most of the time when I'm working up licensing agreements or estimates, I'm really using the words advertising and collateral use pretty much exclusively. Sometimes if we need to negotiate, further define it. So just, you know, web collateral use, that's still collateral use, but it's limited to just web. We've seen words like digital or unlimited. If you think about it, you know, if a client asks you for digital use, you know, there are digital billboards now. What they probably mean is like their website and maybe social media and web advertising, but it's a term that could mean many different things. So I think it's important to avoid terms like that. Definitely try to avoid the term buyout. A buyout just means different things to different people. Sometimes clients assume a buyout is only related to the duration of use, so meaning forever or perpetual. Most of the time people think buyout means just they don't want to ever have to come back to you to talk about licensing again. But it just means different things. So instead of buyout, we actually use the term unlimited, which we define. We actually say unlimited use includes all editorial, publicity, advertising, collateral, public display, and packaging use of the work defined herein. So we are defining the word unlimited, which I think is important because that's one we see a lot as well. And clients ask for that a lot.
Craig, can I jump in a sec? So the other thing that's valuable about creating these definitions is that most clients want unlimited something. And to Craig's point, clients, right, you know, justifiably so, don't want to have to come back to the photographer every time they want to do something a little bit different or more. But in order to be competitive with your rates, you want to have the fee be proportionate to the usage. And so in order to not just sort of give in to this idea of, okay, here are all the pictures and you can use them any way you want, which is what most clients want, to have all the pictures and to use them any way they want forever. And if you're a smart photographer, you will push back against that and say, okay, well, I think we can all acknowledge that more is worth more and less is worth less. So if you can find ways to give the client what they perceive to be unlimited use, but still put a box around it, that's beneficial for you as a photographer. So for example, if you have a client whose intention is to use the pictures on their website, and if you define that as collateral, you can say, okay, you can have collateral use of the pictures, but not publicity and not advertising. And that way the client can get a lower priced photo shoot from you. And if the client subsequently wants to come back and do an advertising campaign, you can say, okay, well, that falls outside of our original agreement, so I'm going to have to quote you an additional fee for that. So by putting your usage in these big buckets, it just gives you tremendous negotiating leverage. One other quick thought is, I think a lot of photographers give up a lot of revenue by handing over the entire take from a shoot. Once a client has all the images, it's very difficult for you to police the usage of those pictures. So I think the simplest thing that any photographer can do to rein in this slippery slope of unlimited use is to license specific photographs. So when you're putting together a quote, think about actual final selects that the client needs and bid it based on that number of images and say up to. So you're going to do a 1 day or 2 day or 3 day shoot, and the client is going to have use of up to X images. And that gives you the opportunity to say, and each additional image will be Y dollars. And it allows you, it gives you the ability to be competitive on price, and if you and to align your interests as a photographer, as the creator, with the client's interest, so that if the shoot goes well, they might want to license additional pictures. But if you're just giving them all the images for the same rate, you don't have the opportunity to charge them extra when things go really well.
I actually think that's I think the best case scenario. What we've seen, and I know a lot of you guys that I've put together estimates for, we've seen clients, of course, just wanting unlimited use forever. I think if you can negotiate one thing, make it be the duration as opposed to the number of images, because you certainly can know if the usage was for 1 year and you're still seeing these billboards 2 years later. That's pretty obvious. I think there are only so many images I think you can create in any given scenario. So, I think the value drastically reduces with the additional number of images that you might be generating for a client. So if you're doing a 1 day shoot with a model against a white background, yeah, sure, maybe you can change their outfit a couple times. But I don't think necessarily image number 300 is as valuable as image number 2. And if it comes to a negotiating point, I'd rather see you guys negotiate a shorter duration of use. If the client thinks they're going to get all the images and they can use them all for 1 year, I think that's better than trying to negotiate a fewer number of images for a longer period of time. I've just been able to see lots of photographers generate additional revenue by negotiating the duration when that licensing expires. Best case scenario, you can limit both. I don't want to get too in the weeds of sort of pricing strategies and value, but I think what's important here is that the words that you use to define the usage are really important, and that's why this definition section is important. Collateral might not mean anything to your client, but if you define it here, you're giving it meaning. And I think value is there's a tremendous amount of value in the language that you use, whether it's in your job description or in your terms and conditions, and that's why this section is so crucially important. Before I get to the payment section, does anyone have any questions or want to jump in with anything?
I'll jump in with one more. Craig, you touched on the idea of proportionality briefly, and I know this is about negotiating more than pricing, than terms and conditions, but I'll just say very briefly that when you are doing estimates for clients, you're trying to provide a price that is sort of fair market value based on your experience, and what Craig mentioned earlier is that often clients will want to see different variations on an estimate. They'll say, can you quote this for 1 year and 3 years? Can you quote this for 5 pictures and 10 pictures? Can you quote this for 2 days and 3 days? And what you want to do is think about how those changes to the parameters of the shoot, how do those impact the value of the shoot to the client, and how do they impact the cost to you, the photographer? And you want to have the numbers make sense in comparison to each other, which is the idea of proportionality. To be cynical, I'm old enough to be a little bit cynical. There are times when a client might ask you to quote something 5 different ways, and they're going to look for the weak quote, where you sort of lost your patience and you just put a number on the page. And they'll say, oh, that one looks good, let's do that. So you just want to make sure that if you're sending out 5 different versions of the quote, that they all equally make sense in relation to one another, so that you don't get stuck just because you've sort of run out of patience about doing estimates?
Yeah, I think it's really important to put pen and paper and math behind the options that you're giving, because I've been in situations, typically the longer the negotiation, the more I know a project might happen. But I've gone through some productions that have taken 20, 25 different versions of estimates before we got to a final place where a client was willing to sign off on. And most of those changes come down to usage. It's like, well, what if it's 1 year? What if it's 2 years? What if we have less talent? What if it, because those numbers, the usage impacts creative licensing fees and talent rates as well for most large productions. So it's really important to not get lost yourself, like Bill said, when putting these numbers together. And I think, like I said, I've helped a lot of photographers put together licensing agreements for when usage has expired. And I think sometimes photographers come to me and they're like, oh, I found this image and it's being used and the licensing was only for 1 year and it's 2 years later. Like, I'm so mad. Like, how can you help me figure this out? I think the approach you should take, whether it's copyright infringement or like it's usage that you negotiated at one point as it expired, the approach to take there is to reach out to the client. Instead of being mad or upset or demanding, it's to kill them with kindness and to say, oh my God, I'm so glad you're still using my photos. I'd love to learn how you've been using them and how you'd love to continue to plan to use them. Can we strike up a conversation so I can work up a quote? And then from there, ideally, you're kind of hitting them over the head with kindness, but also calling them out that they've been using the photos for longer than they should have. And then typically you can work up an agreement, and I can help you do it, to help a client extend the usage. I just worked on a quote yesterday with a financial institution for a photographer, and they extended some images for 10 years. I think it was mostly because they didn't want to think about it. I'm surprised they didn't go for perpetual usage at that point. And generally, I think, the shelf life of most images is probably 5 years or less. I mean, if you think about any image that has fashion or technology or cars in it, like that stuff gets out of date pretty fast. So it gets challenging to price options past 5 years. And when clients ask for, been in the situation, can you give us a price for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years? It's like, you got to put the math behind it because they're asking for it. But if you can negotiate a shorter duration, that's a good thing, because likely you'll be able to negotiate when that licensing expires. But overall, I think just the words you use to describe the usage, aside from the duration, are just incredibly important. And that's why we define those words here. So with that, the next section we have here is about payment terms. So it says that 50% advance retainer is required to initiate production. A client or agency, if project is commissioned and agreed to by agency, shall make payment within 30 days of invoice. Late payments will be billed a $20 a month handling fee and 1.5% per month interest. Applicable sales tax not included, but will be applied to the invoice. Basically, that says that half of the bottom line is going to be paid up front, and the remainder will be due within 30 days from when I send you the invoice. And if you don't pay me on time, I'm going to add interest and late fees. We're specific. This is actually a recent change we've made to our terms and conditions. We're specific on our word choice here when we say a 50% retainer rather than a 50% advance. We used to just say 50% advance or deposit is due. One of the things that we learned from recent webinars as it related to COVID and being in a somewhat of a post-COVID negotiation right now, especially as it relates to cancellation agreements, which we'll get to in a minute, is that from a legal perspective, the word deposits tend to be refundable, but we've learned that the word retainers most times are non-refundable. Generally, a deposit is an advance payment for work that will happen in the future. So if the work doesn't happen, the deposit may need to be returned. But a retainer is payment to secure the future availability or to pay for pre-production work. So it's generally not refundable. Again, we just recently made this change to our terms and conditions based on what we've learned from these webinars and from other people in our industry. But generally what this says here, this payment section, is just about how they're going to pay you and when they're going to have to pay you. With most projects, you're going to want some sort of an advance. It's a negotiation. I think there are some projects where you're not going to have any out-of-pocket expenses whatsoever, and the argument can be made that sure, it's still good to get part of the project, part of the funds up front, just to secure it and to move things along. But with other projects, for large commercial assignments, when the bottom lines are in the six figures and the photographer might be on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars, you're going to want money up front to pay for those things. We've seen 50% of the bottom line. We've seen 50% of expenses. We've seen 100% of expenses as advances that you can get. In the film world, what we've seen, what's common is 50% upfront, 25% at the end of the shoot, and then 25% once the final video is delivered. There's lots of different ways you can go about it, and lots of clients have different approaches to what they can and can't accept. But generally speaking, you want money up front. The note of the interest and late fees, I'll tell you that in my almost 10 years of producing, many clients have paid late, and I've only gotten one of them to actually pay a late fee or interest. It's more of a scare tactic. If you're really tracking down payment and a client is really dragging their feet, and we've been in some situations where clients have been way overdue on payment, we hit them with we start invoicing them and we add interest and late fees. But honestly, it's just about, you want the money that they initially owed you. And if they pay you that, it's more of a scare tactic to be able to show them in a contract that they agreed to, that you'd start charging them monthly fees and interest. But like I said, in all my experience, I think once we got a client to pay an extra $20 because they were like a month late or whatever it was. But I think it's important to have that in here. We've had some clients strike that language and we're not agreeing to that. And it's like, all right, well, it's a negotiating point. And again, we say here that applicable sales tax is not included, but it's going to be on the invoice. So we just take another opportunity here to say that. Before we get to cancellations, anyone have anything they want to jump in with or talk about? Cool. All right. So given everything that has happened recently, obviously cancellations are a hot topic, but they're always kind of an interesting thing to talk about. Same thing with force majeure, which we'll talk about as well, and as a recent addition to our contract or our terms and conditions. I'm going to read what we have here and then give you the layman's terms. So what we say is that in the event of a cancellation or postponement of a shoot by the client or agency at any time after the shoot confirmation or award, the client or agency is going to pay all expenses incurred by the creator up to the time of cancellation, plus a fee equal to 50% of all creative and licensing fees quoted above. If a shoot's canceled within 1 week of a confirmed shoot day, client or agency shall pay up to 100% of creative fees, licensing fees, and expenses quoted above. If a shoot's postponed due to weather, client will be responsible for all expenses incurred on each weather day, plus a creator fee to be agreed upon. Layman's terms, it's important to understand that every cancellation has unique factors that dictate what to charge. But what we're saying here is, if you cancel the project after signing this estimate and it's more than 1 week out from the shoot date, you're going to be on the hook for 50% of the fees detailed in the estimate, plus any actual out-of-pocket expenses that I have incurred. If you cancel the project and it's less than 1 week from the shoot date, you're going to pay me up to 100% of the fees, plus my out-of-pocket expenses. And if the shoot's postponed due to weather, you're going to pay me any expenses already incurred, plus a fee that we're going to agree upon. You'll see we're giving ourselves some wiggle room in here. And generally, you want to protect yourself, but you want to offer some sort of flexibility to negotiate to come to a resolution. I won't say like all of our projects are canceled, but the projects that we had where there's been some sort of cancellation or postponement, or I've been helping a photographer with similar situations, every single one is unique in some way, whether it was due to COVID or weather or a client just pulled out. Every cancellation is unique. I think it's really important to understand that you're going to have to pick and choose your battles. And if you're dealing with your best client, someone that's hired you a lot over the years, and something like this pops up, you're going to want to offer as much flexibility as you possibly can to continue to have them as a client. If the people you're working with have been a pain in the butt and it's been a really stressful production and you have tons of out-of-pocket expenses, this allows you to stick to it and to charge as much as possible. But every project has just really unique factors that may cause a project to be canceled. And I think it's important that we have a distinction here between when, if a project is canceled within a week or outside of a week, in terms of what you might get in terms of reimbursement, especially for your out-of-pocket expenses and your fees. Sometimes with weather fees or cancellation or postponement, sometimes a client might ask us on larger productions to quote them what weather contingency fee might be, just so they know ahead of time that either what it is or they're going to approve it as part of the budget ahead of time. Certainly I've been in productions where it's rained in the middle of the day, and that changes things. And I think you just want to be prepared to know what that's going to look like and who's going to be on the hook and what you're going to be responsible for. With COVID, I spent the first 2 weeks, first week or so, it was kind of just like radio silence. And then most of the consulting I was doing for photographers was helping them work through their cancellation policies. Big projects, small projects that have been agreed to, projects that didn't actually have a contract, projects that were being negotiated, some of which we're about to shoot. Actually, the next pricing and negotiating article that we're going to post, I'll go through how we arrived at the fees and expenses, but it was postponed, or actually it was canceled due to COVID. And you'll see the cancellation agreement that we put together based on when it was canceled. It was a pretty complicated one. But I work with just a lot of photographers to help figure this out. Some photographers, there wasn't an actual agreement, and it was just, we're just not doing it anymore. And since the photographer didn't have really any out-of-pocket expenses, that was just kind of the end of it. Other photographers, had already hired this, that, and the other, and I helped them figure out what to bill for that and what to bill for their creative and licensing fees. I think with licensing fees, if a client doesn't actually have images, it's hard to charge that for cancellation. But every situation is just going to be really unique. It's important to have something. Something's better than nothing. And I think that these terms have definitely helped us. They've helped me get out of some really tricky situations and negotiations for not just our productions, but photographers that have used these. It's been really helpful. Sometimes, again, you're going to be presented with a purchase order as opposed to a client signing your estimate, and just make sure that there's some sort of cancellation policy that's agreeable to you. Interestingly, in that article, you'll see that it's going to come out. It was a pretty massive project. The agency issued a purchase order, and which it was very surprising because it was one of the larger agencies in the world. There was no mention of cancellation. There was no force majeure clause. And we ended up reverting back to this exact terminology that I had helped the photographer craft in the first place to figure out what was going to be appropriate. We were able to recoup some expenses and some fees. But again, it's just important to have something rather than nothing. And that kind of leads into it's all related to the next paragraph about force majeure. And this is, again, one of the newer things that we've added here. Definitely seen it in purchase orders. We never specifically called it out in our terms and conditions, but now it's part of it. It says that neither the creator, client, or agency shall be liable for failure of either party's obligations caused by any circumstances beyond reasonable control, including but not limited to acts of God, epidemics, pandemics, floods, riots, fires, civil unrest, acts of war or terrorism, or failure of energy sources. Layman's terms, if anything happens that's completely out of our control, that impacts my ability to do the work we are agreeing upon, I won't be held liable. Hypothetically, to give you an example, let's say if your production is supposed to take place at a residential property and the night before the shoot it gets struck by lightning, catches on fire, and burns down. That's no one's fault, obviously, but it's important to have a clause in here that says that if that does happen, it's not your responsibility to do anything financially. It's not going to be a breach of the contract if that happens to you. So it's, as we've seen with the pandemic, that was kind of an interesting one, because there were some productions that I was helping photographers with where we could see this coming, and it was like, well, what do we do? When do we cancel? It's an interesting thing, and I'm sure lots of lawyers have made a lot of money over the past 2 months helping clients figure out what their force majeure policy actually says and how applicable it can be to different things. But I think having it in here, again, it's better than not having it in here, and this is what we've come up with. And I think it makes sense to have it there. And lastly, and we'll open it up to questions. The last paragraph we have in here is post-production. It basically says that, well, I'll read it. It says the work will be delivered in a timely fashion with a mutually agreed upon schedule. Any additional retouching requested by the client or agency beyond the scope of the estimate above will be quoted on a case-by-case basis. Layman's terms, we'll decide on what the exact schedule is for file delivery later, and if you want any additional retouching, I'll quote that separately. And last but not least, maybe actually the most important part of the entire list of terms and conditions is a signature line. That's what you want. You want the client to actually sign off on something. So if you have fees and expenses and terms and conditions, but you don't have anywhere for a client to actually sign, that you need to give them that opportunity to actually sign something and put their name down. Generally, it's important to read contracts. It's important to have contracts. It's important to just have something on paper that's not just an email, because if you assume that you're all on the same page, chances are you are not with your client. And then when something weird happens, it's important to know where you stand. As we move forward post-COVID with productions, it's going to be interesting. I'm sure we're going to change things or add things, or new norms are going to be in place. Probably terms and conditions related to cleanliness, maybe and sanitation, maybe limits to client and agency attendees on site to limit the number of people. We might have terms about shoot day length and time it's going to take to clean things. Most changes due to COVID are probably going to mean adding money into the estimate as opposed to terms. So adding money in to have people there to clean things. We're still working through what exactly that's going to look like. I'm personally talking with a bunch of other producers in the industry. There are groups being formed to try to figure out what the new standards are going to look like, for all of us to hopefully agree on the same thing, to force clients to really go with it. But that's a whole other conversation on what that's going to look like. But somehow I'm sure all of this, like Bill said at the beginning, whenever something pops up, it's just an opportunity to add more terms. So I'm sure the next shoot that we do, where it is post-COVID and a lot of people and something happens, we're going to add more terms here that we're going to try to get clients to sign off on. With that, I'd love to hear any weird stories that you guys might have on productions that may have made you add clauses to your terms and conditions, or really just, I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So I'm not going to let this go by without anyone saying anything. So I'm going to call on someone if no one raises their hand.
Yeah. Has anyone had a situation where they were saved by a contract, or has anybody had a situation where they wish they had a better contract?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Hey, Nat.
Hi, it's Natalie Chitwood. Nat, nice to see you guys. I just have to give you the call out, Craig, because you saved me. Gosh, was that 2 years ago at that shoot? Oh, yeah. That's probably one of the most stressful situations I've ever been in. And yes, thank goodness for the signature and having you help me throughout that entire production and jumping on the phone call when it was necessary with their very difficult end of their sister company that didn't know anything about the photo shoot that apparently the company we were dealing with had planned the entire huge production. And I'm trying to remember how far out. We were doing it was a furniture company that wanted to do this lifestyle photo shoot in Pennsylvania. And I live up in New Jersey, and most of my crew is in New York. And so we had people, everything planned out. I mean, gosh, it was a big production. That's why I was able to have Craig helping me with it. And the guy who was the creative behind it, he kind of was a man that wore many hats and a really lovely guy who had me on many phone calls with at least 6 different people from the company planning all of this. And then out of nowhere, I got a phone call from a man I had never talked with. I didn't even know his name. And he just left me a very mean message about he had never approved the shoot. There wasn't the budget for the shoot. And I had been trying to get that 50% up front. And they had been a little weird about that part of it. But, you know, I was trusting the guy that I was dealing with. And we still had some time, maybe a week, not a lot, but I've definitely had problems getting the 50% up front. And I am also way too trusting of a person, but I had that signature and we're moving forward. And then I get this phone call from this man that scared me. I mean, it was over in his mind. And so I instantly called Craig and I thought, you know, what kind of protection do we have here? We have, you know, the digital tech, the prop stylist, my assistant, the talent, like we had so many people involved, and that was really scary. And Craig just calmed me down and walked me through it and agreed to be on the phone call, which in the end we wound up doing the shoot, and it had, you know, many fun little variables and rainstorms and all that. But yeah, we had that massive flooding where like Hershey Park had flooded out. But amazingly, we did the shoot and I got paid up my 50% up front, and I got paid in the end, and, you know, moving forward. But I just had to thank you for that, because you are forever my hero. And I just wanted to, that's my little example for how important that signature is down there. And even when you're trusting the person you're dealing with at the company, it can easily have a sister company that they're umbrellaed under and you don't even know it, and they can throw you a curveball. So thank you.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. I definitely had a lot of curveballs in that project. And yeah, I mean, basically the person who signed the estimate, we found out like didn't have the authority to do so. And their parent company was like, oh, you don't have this money. And we were like well into the production at that point because we had sign off. So it was a very strange situation. And then, yeah, there was like a typhoon at the end of one shoot. And, but yeah, I mean, that's why it's important to have, you know, a signature line, because we had someone physically write their name and signature on an estimate that was a representative of the company that allowed us to move forward. And if we didn't have that, then we wouldn't have any leverage to basically move the project forward. You know, they could have said, oh, we didn't sign anything. You know, there was no agreement. But because we had paperwork and someone signed it, that allowed us to, really, it's all about leverage. It allowed us to have that leverage to keep the project going. So I was happy to help.
Thank you.
I have a question, Craig.
What's up?
What do you recommend? You know, we talked about the length of time for product that has a shelf life, cars or you know, a jacket. What about like someone like Joanna who does animal photography and that may want to sell those to a book publishing company? How would you do length of terms for licensing for publishing companies?
Publishing is a very challenging world to negotiate in. Almost, I'd say publishing and the music industry are notorious for demanding unlimited use and oftentimes getting it for somewhat unreasonable fees. That's not to say, you know, I haven't figured out licensing agreements and contracts for like a book cover that had pretty appropriate fees for unlimited use. But, you know, there certainly could be images that are evergreen. Maybe it is a book cover or an author's portrait, or, you know, you think of, you know, the portrait of Steve Jobs on the biography. Like, it's a pretty iconic photo that, you know, the shelf life of that is going to last a very long time. You see that a lot with like, oddly, like fragrances. Sometimes like colognes and perfumes use images for years and it becomes part of the brand. So I think it's about knowing who you're dealing with. And, you know, with a publishing contract, you know, oftentimes they give you a contract as opposed to, them signing your terms and conditions. And sometimes it's about limiting the print run or the edition or the language, or geographically where the book is going to be published. So there's actually, interestingly, a lot more to potentially negotiate in the publishing world, outside of the duration. Again, it could be the print run, how many books are being published. It could be in what language it's being published, so you could limit the edition. So it could be the first English language edition of a book. Therefore, if it becomes a gigantic bestseller and they want to do foreign language editions, and every time they redo the book with a new forward or they change the book, they'd have to come back to you. There's interestingly a lot to negotiate. A publisher is going to want you to sign like a work made for hire contract, so they don't have to think about it. But ideally, you'll be able to negotiate separate terms. But outside of the publishing world, or maybe the music industry, I mean, I think it's just important to realize that if you're shooting for Ford for their new Mustang campaign, they're probably not going to be using that next year when the new Ford Mustang comes out. So even if you're giving options for 1, 3, 5, 10 years of perpetual use, trying to just wrap your head around how they're likely to use it and the typical shelf life of an image, I think is pretty important. But to your point, there could be images that are evergreen, and certainly there are situations where maybe you'd want to negotiate something other than duration for those kinds of photos.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about the music industry, and pretty much every major label and all the independents right now do a work made for hire or a buyout in some terms, just because they want to be able to use those images whenever and wherever they want forever. A best of CD 50 years from now. They don't want to track down every photographer that's ever shot images of the artist. But and this is pretty much everyone on this call probably knows this, but going into these shoots, even if you're shooting your friend's band that doesn't have a label and you're doing it for $500, get some kind of paperwork, because you're going to see those photos on a billboard over Sunset Boulevard, and then that band's going to get signed to a label, and those photos that you shot for $500 are going to end up being used somewhere.
Speaking from experience there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. Even the smallest project, regardless of the industry, just make sure you get something signed. Even if you're doing a project for free, get something signed that has terms and conditions based on how a client can use it, even if the bottom line is $0. Obviously, you want it to not be $0, but there are plenty of times where we're maybe waiving different fees or expenses to try to make a budget work. And instead of just removing it from an estimate or from the terms, I'm listing, fee waived, expense waived, or, deduction or no cost, whatever it is that it takes to get the job done. We're listing it there, and we're still getting a client to sign off on that stuff. Just so when you look back and they say, a year from now, when they look back and like, hey, we want to hire you again to do that thing that you did for $1,000. Here's the new brief. You can say, yeah, last time it was $1,000, but look at all these things that I waived, and I'm glad that it worked out, but this year I'm going to have to charge for this, that, and the other. Because a contract really serves many purposes, one of which is just prosperity. You can look back and use it as a guide for what you did previously to show them, to justify or to negotiate new work in the future.
So Craig, I'll jump in. Molly's asking in the comments, what to do about companies that use your image on their Instagram without getting your permission when they weren't part of the original shoot. So is this something you've encountered? Social media use by people who don't have any part of the project?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's social media use, any use, whether it's a client that you agreed to something up front, or it's someone that's using your photo that you have no idea who they are. I think, again, it's all about how you present it. If you reach out to them and express enthusiasm for them using your work and ask them how they've used it and how they continue to plan to use it, and let them know that you're going to work up a quote so they can continue to use it, that's a good way to go about it. I think all of you, if you used like Google's reverse image search or those similar services and put in your photo, you're going to find many people that have used your photos in some way that maybe they shouldn't have, clients that you've never heard of before. And I think you're going to have to choose your battles on which ones are worth fighting. So certainly if a major organization is using it, whether it's Instagram or not, that's a battle worth fighting. If it's some blogger that somehow pulled your image from Google and used it on like a blog post, I think it's infringement, but the time and energy it's going to take you to track down who they are, get an email address, negotiate all of that, it can be really time consuming, and you just have to be cognizant of that. There are certainly companies that are out there that will do that stuff for you on spec and then keep a percentage of any money that they're able to get. There are lots of, intellectual property lawyers you can work with. But generally, I always want to take the approach where if you find a client using your photo, to, again, just try to kill them with kindness as opposed to demanding things. I feel like that never gets you what you want. So just be nice to people.
And Molly, do you have any other details you can provide about that? Are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. Hi.
So who was the, can you tell us about the client? Was it a real client with, what are the circumstances?
So the company that used it was like they manufacture like faucets and hardware for bathrooms. And it was shot for a book, and the person I shot it for put it on their Instagram, and that company in the comments said, could we use this picture? We'll credit you. And the person I shot for said, you'll have to ask the photographer. And they didn't. They just went ahead and used it on their Instagram and credited me for the photo. So, I mean, they're in my industry, so I just wasn't sure how to go about it. I mean, is it good to like have the Instagram publicity of being tagged in that situation, or should you ask for money?
I mean, I think certainly there's value in a credit. Ideally, it comes with a client that's paid to use your photo first. But I think you should reach out to them. If this is a client that used your photo and they're in your industry and there's someone that you want to work for, maybe the better thing to do is to reach out and to say, I'm really excited to use my photo, even though you weren't, authorized to do so. Can we talk about, future shoots, or, what can we do for me to get on your radar? I think the value, if they had reached out and said, hey, can we use your photo on one Instagram post? Maybe the value is clients might want to pay $100 or so for something like that, maybe a little bit more. So I think it's just about, if you go in full steam and demanding they take it down, and being, if they see you as a difficult person and they're in your industry and they're a potential client of yours, that's not going to look good. I think the better thing to do is to try to figure out how to get a conversation started with them. If they used it in a print ad or a billboard or something worth tens of thousands of dollars in licensing, I think that's a different story. I think then you start nice, and then you bring in a lawyer to help negotiate that. So I think that might be a case of, instead of going in full steam, you try to work it over smoothly. I think definitely bring it up. Don't just let it slide, but maybe try to turn it into an opportunity for future work.
Okay.
Yeah, I would actually go a little bit harder than that. This is what Craig and I have worked together for a long time now, so we disagree a lot. I would be inclined as a photographer to want to get compensated for that use. I spent 25 years listening to clients promise me photo credits, and I said, I can't pay my mortgage with a photo credit. So I want to get paid for my photography. Certainly there's a lot to be said for doing it in the right way. But I would encourage you to press for compensation. And if you can get a client out of it, that's great. But I wouldn't be inclined to want to work for a client that is just ripping people off. So I don't know. I think it's a case-by-case situation. Dan has his hand raised. Dan, what do you got?
Yeah, Molly, I think we're probably in a similar industry, and it's happening more and more for when I shoot. I do a lot of architectural photography for like architects, interior designers, and that type of thing. And it's absolutely crazy it's almost like so rapidly unfolding and unraveling over the course of like the last like year or two, even where even a couple of years ago, people would reach out for credit and, hey, can I use this photo, blah, blah, blah. Now this is a new thing that a couple different companies are doing. This is Ann Sachs Tile, right? They're a big tile company.
Mhm.
So they'll write in the comment section of an interior designer I work with, they say, we would love to share your Ann Sachs inspired idea on our digital properties. Reply hashtag my Ann Sachs to agree. Terms, and it has a link that you can't even click on. Thank you. So it's almost like
I've seen those.
a couple companies doing this. As like Ann Sachs, there's like interior design. Even Norwegian Cruise Line started doing this with like, here are the terms. Here, reply with this hashtag to agree to our terms in a link that you can't even click on. It's like they know what they're doing. That's what really pisses me off about it, because like they're trying to make it legal, but it's like in no way is it legal, because in no way you can't even read those terms. I don't know. I just think it's Bill.
I have seen those where I could click on the terms and read them.
Okay.
And read them, and it was like, we get all rights to this image and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But the designers, they never have like the rights to give away or.
And I think that's part, it's really tough. It goes a lot with educating your client as well, so that your client isn't like, hey, yeah, that'll be great, blah, 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 reply my Ann Sachs. So I don't know. It's just a lot of conversation, but I agree with Bill with like, in those cases, it's like they so know what they're doing. It's almost like they should be dealt with a little more sternly. But then on Craig's hand, I agree with, because everyone's doing it. So it's like, how do you police it at a certain point? So it's hard to balance that.
Yeah, well, I think to Bill's point, I think it's a good combination would be to do what both of us are saying. So first, to start off by being, nice and trying to drum up a conversation, and then 2 days go by, you haven't heard from them, then the invoice comes. Then it's good cop, bad cop.
But you just invoice on Instagram, because you might not have the contact person to invoice, or like how do you.
I think that goes back to my point on, how much time do you want to spend on every infringement? Yeah, the time it might take you to figure out who the right person is to invoice $100, it might be, on principle, I get it. But, if you do a reverse image search and find 100 potential infringements, that's a whole career in and of itself to try to track all of that down and figure out who to send the invoice to and all those correspondences. You do that, or do you work on a marketing campaign to get new work from different clients? It's all about picking your battles.
Quarantine, baby, we got nothing but time right now.
Good point.
But I think in general, I know a lot of photographers tend to not put a lot of energy into figuring out how to do proper licensing agreements and proper contracts. And I think it's really important for photographers to embrace that, the licensing model, because every photographer who just sort of lets it all slide is just making it harder for every other photographer to get that. We're sort of fighting for a culture. Like if we're all part of the culture, and if we're going to help sort of support a culture where photographers are not worth very much and they don't need to be respected, well then that's not much of a future. And I've been in the business for 35 years, and the conversation hasn't really changed much in 35 years. But I do think it's important, like if you're going to, as a photographer, if you're going to strive to maintain your creative edge, I think you need to strive to maintain your business edge as well, not only for your individual benefit, but for the benefit of the whole industry. And so we'll try to keep helping educate you guys. All right, well, it's 3:20, so we've got to sort of bring this to a close. We've got a couple more minutes if anybody else has anything else that they want to jump in with. Anybody?
Hi, I have one question.
Yeah.
It's about unemployment, and I know it's a curveball again, but so luckily I've had a few job opportunities. Some of them don't exactly make sense for even what I do, but one of them does. And, you know, I just got the unemployment in New Jersey finally coming through. So to lose that to do this one job that isn't a huge ad job or anything. So I'm really torn. It's really hard to find any information. So if you guys have any feedback on that, it's really what I'm trying to figure out is.
You mean if you take the job, do you have to give up your unemployment?
Right. Like it's not a big paying job. It's really just a small food job. And it has the potential to become a regular thing. So it could be every week, but it's also, so in that way it would be obviously more than unemployment, but it also has the potential of you just do it the one time and then they open back up in New York. So they don't need to shoot it in New Jersey all of a sudden, or I have some holds in June that haven't actually canceled yet. So I'm like, what if those are happening again? And there's so many unknowns that, and the unemployment was such a headache to get it to actually come through with the pandemic. And I'm just a LLC, I'm not incorporated or anything. So I just don't know if you do a job, a small little job, does that kill all the pandemic unemployment? Does anyone know?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Another call, another time, maybe.
The short answer is I don't know, but you're not alone. You know, just yesterday, a photographer emailed me the same thing, and it was really a moral question.
Yeah.
Know? It was like, well, what if I just like do it under the table and I don't report it, and like, what are the ramifications? And who knows? I don't know. You know? I don't know how that works. Obviously, it's so different for like a freelance industry. It's one thing if you get hired full time somewhere, like, then yeah, like of course, like unemployment goes away. But you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is you're not alone. That so many people are in that exact same situation and trying to figure it out. And I don't know if the IRS is going to come after you. You know, I think you might be a small fish, you know, in the end when they're trying to deal with all this stuff. But who knows? I don't know how to answer that question.
I know in Canada, they have it like I applied and got their first payment that they offered. But after that, if you made they've changed it now. If you make over 1,000, then you don't qualify for it up here. So, but I don't know what the US, if they've got maybe something on the website to see on that, right?
Not yet, but that's very helpful. That's kind of what I was wondering. Yeah, if they will.
Yeah. Yeah. Otherwise we'll deal with it later.
Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you for showing up today. I really enjoyed the discussion, and of course, thank you, Craig. I can tell you, in 9 years, I've never had any staff member of ours get more compliments than Craig about his expertise on estimates. And Nat, you know, you're one of many people who've told me that Craig has just saved them. And so here's to you, Craig. All right. So thanks everybody for showing up, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.